Dead America. The Woodsman by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 11. Southwest from International Falls, Minnesota. The sun's slow ascent over the horizon painted the wintry landscape with delicate strokes of pale, muted colors as the woodsman embarked on his daily ritual. In this precarious season, teetering on the brink between fall and winter, daylight dwindled, becoming a precious and fleeting commodity. Urgency infused his every movement, as if he were racing against the inexorable passage of time itself. The frigid air bit through his thick jacket, a relentless reminder of winter's harsh embrace. Despite his remarkable physical condition for a man in his 50s, he couldn't escape the occasional groan of protesting joints, a reminder that Father Time is undefeated. The freshly fallen snow, like a pristine white canvas, covered the ground, lending an eerie quietude to the forest. Even with a few delicate flakes continuing to drift down, the woodsman could discern the odd, uneven trails etched into the snow, like the restless marks of some nocturnal creature. These once formidable adversaries had lost their former grace and speed. The terrifying days of relentless pursuit had given way to an ungainly, disjointed shuffle. Sub-zero temperatures now tormented their stiffened joints and frozen muscles. Yet the woodsman knew better than to underestimate his foes. Each step he took in the snow was a testament to caution and silence. This dense, untamed terrain was his sanctuary, the place where he had retreated to years ago, seeking solitude and refuge from the clamor of the world. Once he had been a part of the corporate whirlwind, amassing wealth and power. But one day, he had reached a breaking point, choosing to escape the harsh grip of that life. He had yearned for a simpler existence, far removed from the ceaseless clamor of the city, away from the cruelties of human society. Retreating into this remote wilderness had felt like the right decision, and when the Texas zombie virus had swept across the nation, it had only solidified his choice. However, even here, miles away from the small city of International Falls, he couldn't escape unwelcome visitors. A faint sound disrupted the pre-dawn stillness, causing him to halt abruptly. Though the darkness enveloped the landscape, the clear sky and the feeble moonlight offered just enough visibility. Peering through the dense trees, he spotted two zombies ensnared by a massive fallen branch. One was a young man, his flesh marred by countless bite marks, struggling futilely to free himself from the wooden trap. Beside him stood a young woman of similar age, seemingly untouched, except for the pointed branch that pierced her abdomen. Both creatures writhed in frustration, ensnared by their predicament and yet incapable of overcoming it. As the woodsman reached for an arrow from his quiver, his mind wandered. The woodsman, as he had come to be known, couldn't help but contemplate the tragic circumstances surrounding the young man's fate. It was likely that he had been attempting to protect his ailing girlfriend when the inevitable transformation had occurred, catching him off guard. With his bow drawn and an arrow nocked, the woodsman took careful aim, targeting the less securely trapped of the two. In a soft, almost reverent tone, the woodsman whispered to himself, "May you find peace, young man." The arrow was released with a soft swish, slicing through the frigid air and finding its mark in the side of the young man's skull. He staggered briefly, the freezing temperatures prolonging his upright stance due to frozen joints. Moments later, he succumbed to gravity, collapsing over the fallen branch. His girlfriend displayed no reaction. Remaining perfectly still, the woodsman kept a vigilant eye on the female zombie, ensuring she didn't become agitated enough to break free. When he was confident that she posed no further threat, he prepared another arrow. Whispering softly once more, he said, "Allow me to reunite you with him." The female zombie heard his words and turned toward him, emitting a mournful moan as the arrow pierced her eye. Like her deceased companion, she remained upright for a few moments before her body finally yielded to gravity. The woodsman remained on guard, listening intently to the pre-dawn silence, wary of any unexpected surprises. The past week and a half had taught him that despite their lack of coordination, these creatures had a knack for showing up when least expected. To his relief, there were no more sounds in the vicinity, and he finally relaxed his guard. He approached the lifeless couple, retrieving his arrows and wiping the cool, semi-dried blood from their clothes. Standing over them for a moment, he checked their pockets for anything useful. A discarded wallet was flung aside, but his search revealed a lighter in the other pocket. The woodsman mused, a little extra fire never hurt anybody. He pocketed the lighter and turned away, leaving the motionless ghouls behind. With the sun poised to rise, it was time for his morning inspection of the cabin's perimeter, a routine he performed with a solemn sense of duty in this desolate world. As the woodsman approached his rustic homestead, each step seemed to carry the weight of his solitary existence. He made his way to the rear of the property, guided by the familiar path that led to a double stepladder. This ladder, a humble yet indispensable tool, bridged the gap over the encircling barbed wire barricade. Its function was deceptively simple. 3 strands of barbed wire formed a square perimeter guarding his refuge. Although it was unimposing, it served its purpose well. Upon reaching the other side of the wire, the woodsman methodically pulled the stepladder over, gently placing it on the ground. The nascent sun, still hidden beneath the horizon, cast a soft golden glow over the landscape, hinting at the promise of a new day. As he rounded the corner of his weathered house, the woodsman's keen eyes spotted an older creature ensnared in the unforgiving embrace of the barbed wire. It writhed and thrashed in a desperate struggle, its undead existence made no less miserable by its predicament. The woodsman sighed, for though dispatching this creature was a straightforward task, he knew he would have to haul the corpse away from his home. The relentless winter cold would not last forever, and the ensuing stench would be unbearable. Approaching the trapped zombie with measured steps, the woodsman reached for a claw hammer secured in a makeshift holster on his belt. Standing before the ensnared abomination, he took a moment to study its repulsive features. The zombie appeared to be an older man, perhaps in his 50s, wearing a tattered, blood-soaked suit. Its vacant eyes stared into nothingness, its mouth agape with red stains adorning the corners, evidence of its recent feasting on hapless victims. The woodsman, his rough hand stroking his beard, wrestled with the task of placing a name to the face before him. After a brief pause, recognition dawned upon him. "Bill Burnett," he muttered. Memories of brief encounters with the man from his corporate days flickered through his mind. While he hadn't known Bill intimately, they had crossed paths on occasion. "What's it been, Bill?" 6, 7 years. I think it was that holiday mixer at the law firm. You were there with your wife. The woodsman furrowed his brow, attempting to recall the name of Bill's wife, but it eluded him. "Guess her name doesn't matter," he muttered. "Because if I had to venture a guess, that's her blood caked around your mouth. It's a shame, because you two looked really happy back then." A faint chuckle escaped him as he reminisced about Bill's wife incessantly pestering him about taking her on a vacation to the Florida Keys. "Well, Bill, I hope that you gave her that vacation before all this happened." The woodsman raised his hammer high, its steel head gleaming in the faint light of dawn, and brought it down with a resounding crack upon the creature's skull, splitting it open. Bill's lifeless body slumped over the barbed wire, and the woodsman, with a grim resolve, gave it a shove to clear the wire. "You sit tight. I'll be back soon," he said with a hint of sadness. With the immediate threat addressed, the woodsman resumed his rounds, inspecting the remainder of the perimeter before considering entering his home to bask in the warmth of a crackling fire. However, a glance back at Bill's remains changed his mind. "Okay, let's get you squared away before breakfast." He headed toward the front section of the barbed wire, where he had another stepladder stashed. After setting it up, he hoisted himself over and took a moment to stretch his tired limbs before approaching his fallen business associate. "Might not be the beach, but you're getting one more trip." Struggling for a moment, he managed to lift Bill's lifeless form off the ground and began dragging it through the snow. The journey was a bit of a trek through the dense forest, but the snow-covered ground made it somewhat easier. After several minutes and approximately half a mile, they reached their destination. Before him lay an open pit in the frozen ground, strewn with shovels and various digging implements. The harsh cold had made digging a daunting task, but over the course of the past week, the woodsman had managed to excavate a mass grave for the creatures he had dispatched. The woodsman gazed down at his handiwork, where around 36 lifeless bodies lay in a macabre heap. There was barely enough room for one more. He eyed the shovel, knowing that he would need to dig more space eventually. But the frozen ground was unyielding for now. Maybe when this stuff melts, it'll soften it up. In the meantime, though, his voice trailed off as he dragged Bill over to the edge of the mass grave and rolled him in. Standing there for a moment, he caught his breath, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of the morning's activities and the past week weigh heavily upon him. Okay, time for some breakfast. Then it's right back to it. Have to make the highway check today. The task had been haunting his thoughts for days, and he had repeatedly postponed it. Despite his remote location in the woods, he still had a driveway leading directly to the highway that connected the small town of Little Fork to the sprawling city of International Falls. Word had spread among survivors across the country that more populated areas were emptying out as zombies sought new territories. Camouflaging the entrance to his property was a necessity, but it came with considerable risk. For several hours, he would be exposed to the world beyond. A single pack of ghouls spotting him could spell disaster. Yet the falling snow offered a modicum of cover, allowing him to blend into his surroundings to some extent. Breakfast first, though. Knowing it would be his only meal until sundown, he commenced the hike back to his domain. As he neared the edge of his property, a faint noise stirred his senses, putting him on high alert. With swiftness born of necessity, the woodsman drew his bow, loading an arrow as he cautiously approached the clearing. The air was filled with the familiar sound of shuffling footsteps, a common occurrence. What unsettled him, however, was the rhythmic, controlled knocking, a stark contrast to the usual chaotic movements of the undead. Emerging from cover, the woodsman aimed his bow toward his humble abode, his voice sharp and commanding. Don't you move a muscle. Chapter 2. The woodsman, a solitary figure, stood sentinel at the edge of his property, his weathered face tense as he gripped the bow, its string pulled taut. His eyes were fixed on an unexpected sight, a young couple standing just outside his house. Jenny, in her mid-20s, possessed an air of determination with her dark hair and toned physique. Peter, in his mid-30s, towered over her with a muscular frame and blonde hair. Caught in the crosshairs of the woodsman's scrutiny, they raised their hands in surrender, a mix of fear and frosty air chilling their breath. Please don't shoot, Peter's voice trembled. The woodsman's voice cut through the cold air. What are you doing at my house? We just need help, Jenny implored, her voice carrying a sense of urgency. Why in the world would you think I would be handing that out? The woodsman retorted with a guarded demeanor. Does it look like I'm particularly welcoming to guests? Desperation etched across Jenny's face as she explained, Please, we don't have anywhere else to go. The tension lingered, with the woodsman keeping his bow trained on Peter. He surveyed their surroundings, spotting 2 sets of footprints leading to his driveway, revealing his delayed attempts to conceal it. It looks like I waited a day too long to hide the driveway, he muttered to himself. We're not a threat, I promise, Peter affirmed, his words laden with sincerity. The woodsman finally lowered his bow, a small sigh of relief escaping the young couple. I'll inspect you for bites, which means you're going to be stripping down to your skivvies. Non-negotiable, he declared, a gruff tone marking his authority. If it means we can come inside, then I don't mind that at all. Jenny replied. Peter hesitated briefly but consented. The woodsman directed them to step back from the front door, emphasizing his cautious nature. As he pushed the door open, warmth and a dim light spilled into the cold, dark evening. The couple remained outside, their expressions a mix of gratitude and trepidation. Stepping into the cozy interior, the woodsman motioned for them to follow. "Well, come on now, you're letting the heat out," he urged, his voice less stern inside the welcoming abode. The couple hurried inside, their frozen fingers struggling to comply with his request to strip down. The woodsman observed them closely, his eyes scanning their blood-stained attire. Surprisingly, there were no tears or visible wounds. He gestured for them to approach the fireplace. "Go get warm. I'm going to take you at your word that you're not bitten," he conceded. "Thank you, sir. And we are clean. No bites," Peter reiterated with gratitude. "I believe you. Now, go get warm. I'll fix some food," the woodsman responded, already moving toward the kitchen. "We can't thank you enough," Jenny exclaimed. "You say that now, but all I have are powdered eggs and potatoes for breakfast," the woodsman warned with a hint of humor. Jenny managed a faint chuckle as she and Peter approached the crackling fire, their cold hands inching closer to the life-giving warmth. "I'd back up a little from the fire. Those pins and needles are going to sting if you warm up too quickly," the woodsman advised, showing a rare touch of concern. They heeded his counsel, wincing as sensation gradually returned to their frostbitten fingers. "So tell me your story. Who are you, and how did you find yourself on my doorstep?" the woodsman inquired, his curiosity piqued. "I'm Jenny, and this is Peter. We're both from International Falls," Jenny began. "A couple?" the woodsman questioned. "No, we just met last week when we were escaping town," Peter clarified. "We both ended up at this gas station just off the highway in Pelland," Jenny continued. "It was us and 8 others, huddled together inside the convenience store, surviving on junk food and some mystery meat that has probably been there since the dawn of time," Peter added. "Zombie apocalypse or not, you couldn't pay me to eat a gas station hot dog," the woodsman remarked, offering a hint of camaraderie. 2 weeks ago, I would have been right there with you. Reality has a way of forcing things on you, though," Jenny reflected. The woodsman chuckled softly as he prepared a dish of powdered eggs. "How bad was International Falls?" he asked, not realizing the depth of the trauma he might trigger. Both Jenny and Peter fell silent, their faces bearing the weight of collective trauma. The woodsman quickly regretted his question. "It's okay. You don't have to talk about it," he reassured them, pointing to a ham radio in the corner. "I've heard from people all over the country, and it's not good anywhere." "It's okay. We've just had a rough go of it, you know," Jenny replied, her voice tinged with sorrow. "My nightmare started at the bank," Peter began, his words punctuated by a shiver that passed through his body. "I was there early, working diligently on paperwork, preparing for the day ahead. I was just about to insert the key into the lock, anticipating the moment when we would welcome our first customers, when the trouble began." A momentary pause followed as Peter collected himself, his emotions getting the better of him. He continued with a deeper breath, his voice still laced with the trauma of the memory. "I had the keys firmly gripped in my hand, walking towards the front door when there was this frantic banging echoing through the bank. It was a mother and her young child, their faces etched with terror, more frightened than I had ever seen anyone, at least up until that point." Peter's words trailed off briefly, his eyes distant as he recalled the vivid details of that encounter. He blinked back the tears that threatened to well up in his eyes before continuing. "The mother had a splash of blood on her shirt and face, and the child bore a similar gruesome stain. It took me a moment to grasp the horrifying truth of the situation. By the time I connected the dots that her child was the one who was injured, Peter's voice faltered, unable to articulate the unspeakable horrors he had witnessed. Peter took a deep, shaky breath, gathering his composure before pressing on with the harrowing account. They reanimated, or whatever the hell they do. A somber silence hung in the air as Peter's memories weighed heavy on his heart. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if in reverence for the gruesome tale being told. It was over before I could even register what was happening. Peter finally continued. The child, with a hunger that defied reason, latched onto his mother's throat. The poor woman's eyes filled with shock and sorrow, faded quickly as she fell to the ground. All I could do was cower behind a desk in sheer terror, watching this little gremlin rip his mother's throat out, devouring her like a starving man at an all-you-can-eat buffet. The room grew still as Peter's words hung heavy in the air, the gruesome imagery etched into the minds of those who listened. After a moment, Peter cleared his throat and resumed his narrative. After what felt like an eternity, the child seemed to lose interest and scampered away, chasing after someone who had driven by. I thought about trying to help the mother, but before I could summon the courage to do so, she inexplicably rose to her feet and fled. The woodsman, who had been a silent witness to Peter's chilling tale, finally spoke. My condolences. That's a rough way to start the morning. Peter nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze distant as he continued to grapple with the memories that haunted him. Tell me about it. I don't think I moved from my hiding spot for hours, just occasionally poking my head out to look at the street. By the time lunchtime rolled around, it was mostly quiet out. The people who were outside when it began were either hiding like I was, or they had joined the ranks of the damned, spent 5 days hiding in the bank, eating every morsel of food in the break room before making a run for it, managed to escape downtown, getting to the convenience store where Jenny and the others were. What about you? The woodsman asked to Jenny. Not quite as dramatic as Peter's ordeal, Jenny began, her voice trembling slightly. I was driving back from Winnipeg after attending a friend's birthday celebration. I reached town just before the break of dawn, and it was immediately apparent that something was horribly amiss. Jenny's hands quivered as she continued her narrative, the memories still vivid and raw. I pulled up to my apartment building, and that's when my neighbor Carlos came running out. I hadn't even stepped out of my car when he flung open the passenger door and jumped in, his eyes filled with sheer terror, urging me to drive. Jenny continued. Carlos worked the overnight shift at the supercenter, stocking the shelves. He told me people were going crazy, attacking anybody who came within arm's reach of them, and begged me to get him out of town. I knew Carlos wasn't one to exaggerate, so I complied. We managed to get just outside the city limits when a car blew through a stop sign and hit us. After that, we were on foot. With how fast those things were, it was a miracle we made it to the gas station. The only ones we came across before getting inside were focused on the cars on the highway. One person wrecked, and it was a logjam. People trapped in their cars, nowhere to go. The woodsman gazed into the flickering fire, a sympathetic aura surrounding him as he addressed Peter and Jenny. I'm sorry you both had to go through that, he said, his voice carrying a soothing tone that belied the chaos of the world outside. I've been lucky enough to ride this out here, sitting by the fire and reading my books. Well, that and building what defenses I could with the limited materials I have. Peter nodded, a hint of longing in his eyes. This would definitely be my preferred way to ride the apocalypse out, that's for sure. As they talked, the woodsman continued his culinary endeavor, working diligently to transform powdered eggs into something resembling a decent meal. So, why did you leave the gas station? The woodsman inquired, his voice laced with curiosity. I know the one you're talking about, and it's pretty nice. Fortified too. Peter and Jenny exchanged a worried glance, their expressions reflecting the gravity of their decision. The woodsman noticed their unease and spoke in a more serious tone. Why did you leave? Tell me now. Jenny hesitated for a moment before revealing. A mob hit us, coming from International Falls. Peter chimed in, Guess the traffic jam finally got pushed out of the way because a whole mess of them swarmed the building. The others wanted to stay, Jenny continued, her voice tinged with regret, but we didn't think the windows would hold. So just before they got too close, we snuck out the back. We watched from a distance as the creatures surrounded the gas station, Peter added, his voice trembling. We heard gunshots, followed by an eerie silence as dozens of those abominations breached the building's defenses. The room grew colder, the fire's warmth offering little solace against the chilling memories. It was at this moment that the woodsman's demeanor shifted, his expression turning serious, almost menacing. "Did any of them follow you?" The woodsman's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere, demanding an answer. Jenny and Peter exchanged concerned glances, their anxiety palpable. The woodsman's tone had shifted, and they understood the gravity of his question. "What?" Jenny stammered, taken aback by the sudden intensity. The woodsman's voice rose, filled with urgency and dread. "Did any of them follow you?" Peter's response was swift, though tinged with guilt. "Just a few, but they were several hundred yards behind us when we started walking." The woodsman's frustration was palpable as he exclaimed, "Damn it!" He moved hastily toward a wooden floor chest, tearing it open with urgency, and began rummaging through its contents. Items were flung onto the floor indiscriminately. Blankets, bits of metal, and various odds and ends he deemed unnecessary. Jenny and Peter exchanged concerned glances. Jenny chimed in, attempting to reassure him. They were plenty far behind us, and far more interested in the building than us. But the woodsman's face remained tense as he explained. "You don't get it. Those things are like bloodhounds. They see or hear you. They just keep going in that direction." He posed a pointed question, his voice laced with unease. "Let me ask you something. When you opened the gate to my driveway, did you do it gently?" Both newcomers contemplated the memory, their expressions shifting to a more somber note. Peter spoke sheepishly, realizing the implication of his actions. It slammed open. The woodsman's suspicions were confirmed, and he nodded gravely. "Yeah, just as I figured." With a final, forceful push, the woodsman cleared the chest of any useless debris. From within the depths of the container, he retrieved an old paint can, tightly sealed and sporting a fuse protruding from the top. Jenny and Peter's faces contorted with a mix of curiosity and fear. Jenny couldn't help but inquire, her voice trembling slightly. "What is that?" The woodsman's eyes bore into the sealed paint can, his grip firm. "This is my one and only fail-safe. And you better hope it works, because if it doesn't, all three of us are going to be right back out in the cold." The gravity of their situation weighed heavily on Peter and Jenny, their expressions a blend of terror and remorse. "Sir, I am so sorry that we—" The woodsman silenced him with a wave of his hand. "What's done is done. Can't say I would have done any different if I were in your position. But I need you to sit tight and stay quiet. Do not go outside. Do you understand me? I don't care what you hear. You stay put." Both Jenny and Peter nodded in agreement as the woodsman prepared for a dangerous task. He slung a makeshift explosive into a bag, throwing it over his shoulder as he readied his bow and arrows, along with a fire axe, which he carried on a sling. "Eggs are ready. You're on your own for potatoes," the woodsman said tersely, a final instruction before he left the shelter. With a sense of foreboding, he shut the door behind him, leaving Jenny and Peter to their own devices. They hoped that they had made the right choice in trusting their safety to the woodsman, and that the makeshift explosive would keep them safe from the relentless pursuit of the creatures. The room's silence was deafening, broken only by the crackling of the fire as they waited anxiously for his return. Chapter 3. The woodsman moved with measured haste down the snow-laden driveway, his aging frame navigating the terrain cautiously to avoid any potential injuries. A simmering anger coursed through his veins. All he had ever yearned for was solitude, a desire unmet, even amidst the wreckage of a world where 80% of the nation's population had perished. Why did these trespassers have to show up on my doorstep? He pondered bitterly. There are hundreds of square miles of untamed woods for them to explore and find refuge in. Yet they chose my driveway, my sanctuary. It would have been troubling enough if they arrived alone, but they brought unwelcome company. A quarter-mile down the path, the unmistakable chorus of moaning reached his ears, sending a shiver down his spine. It was not the predatory, anticipatory sounds these creatures made when they were about to pounce, but rather the aimless, confused murmurs they emitted when isolated, as though they couldn't fathom why they were producing such eerie utterances. With a deft motion, he readied an arrow, its tip gleaming with a lethal intent, as he continued his careful advance. Each step carried a growing sense of urgency. Before he could reach the bend ahead, a grotesque figure emerged, shambling along the path. The woodsman took aim and released the arrow. It struck true, dropping the ghoul in its tracks. Drawing another arrow, he prepared himself, for he could hear more moans approaching from behind the fallen creature. It wasn't long before new arrivals made their presence known. 15 more creatures materialized around the curve, moving with an eerie synchronicity. The woodsman slowly lowered his arrow, the realization setting in that he had just a dozen bolts left in his quiver. "That won't suffice," he muttered under his breath. Though the thought of wielding his trusty axe and getting his hands dirty crossed his mind, it quickly dissipated as another 20 or so creatures emerged, rounding the bend of the driveway. The woodsman remained composed, but a reflexive step backward bought him a few precious seconds to formulate his strategy. The haunting moans from the nearby woods drew his attention. Peering through the tangle of trees, he spotted a smattering of creatures in the forest. At first, it seemed to be just a few, but upon closer inspection, he realized there were dozens, dispersed and shambling inexorably in his direction. "If they reach the house, it's over," he declared. "That barbed wire isn't going to hold up against them." He knew what he must do, even if he loathed the idea. It was their sole chance at survival. "I've got to cross the highway and draw them away," he acknowledged. Fully aware of the risks, he swapped his bow for his axe, gripping it tightly and psyching himself up for the ordeal that lay ahead. Finally, the woodsman made his move, breaking from his position and dashing into the woods directly towards a lone zombie. He swung his axe in a fluid, deadly arc, catching the creature on the side of its head. The impact was forceful enough to pierce the skull, and with a quick yank, he retrieved his weapon, leaving the ghoul lifeless on the forest floor. Navigating the dense woodland terrain, he nimbly wove through the labyrinth of limbs and outstretched arms, reaching for their morning meal. "This is insane," he muttered. He ventured about 20 yards off the driveway before confronting another creature he couldn't sidestep. This time, the ghoul loomed tall, a formidable 6-footer, brawny and menacing in stature. Its guttural moan reverberated through the woods as it lunged, but the woodsman deftly sidestepped with a grace born of survival instinct. A well-placed shove sent the hulking yet clumsy creature careening into a tree. A jagged branch impaled its torso, rendering it incapacitated. With the weight of the pinned ghoul immobilizing it, the creature thrashed helplessly, incapable of understanding the simple act of retreating. The woodsman had no time to savor his victory, for more creatures emerged from the shadows. As one extended a grasping hand toward him, he skillfully employed the top of his axe to repel it, creating a brief opening for his escape. Continuing his mad dash through the trees, he heard moans all around him, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, a symphony of dread that intensified his fear, a constant reminder of the impending death encroaching from all directions. Finally, the woodsman found himself within view of the highway, and his heart sank, his worst fears realized. There were hundreds of creatures scattered about, all seemingly following the incomprehensible lead of the one in front. Descending from the street and advancing along the driveway or disappearing into the tangled woods. How in the hell am I going to get through this? He wondered aloud. His gaze fell to his bag where he spotted an explosive device. This might be the ticket, he contemplated. However, he swiftly dismissed the reckless idea. Such an attempt would likely leave him stranded in the woods, faced with only two grim choices: certain death or a brutal journey back to the house that would inevitably draw the ravenous horde in his wake. Think, man, think, he beseeched himself. As he pondered further, an idea took root. Not born of inspiration, but born of grim necessity, as he reminded himself of the dire consequence of inaction. If you don't do it, you're dead, he acknowledged, the gravity of his situation pressing upon him. The woodsman continued to speak to himself, his voice laced with determination as he tried to build a convincing case within the confines of his mind. It was an uphill battle, but he slowly found his way there. Here goes nothing, he muttered. With a sudden burst of activity, he began making as much noise as possible, resorting to yelling, whistling, and anything he could think of to draw the attention of the creatures lurking on the desolate highway. To his relief, the audacious gambit worked like a charm. Ghouls started peeling away from the road, drawn by the commotion. Some of them stumbled over a small drainage ditch, while others got caught in the tangled embrace of trees, creating gaps in their advancing ranks. He stood firm, patiently waiting for the mob to thin out as much as possible before making his move. In the hushed stillness of the snowy woods, he suddenly detected movement approaching from behind. The woodsman swiftly spun around, his gaze locking onto two ghouls rapidly closing the distance. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, gripping the axe tightly as he brought it down with tremendous force. The blade embedded itself so deeply into the creature's skull that it became lodged there, and the weapon slipped from his grasp as the lifeless ghoul collapsed to the ground. As the second zombie closed in, the woodsman acted swiftly. He drew an arrow from his quiver, clenching it tightly as he thrust it upwards. The arrowhead pierced the bottom of the ghoul's jaw, tearing through the top of its mouth and penetrating into its brain. He held the creature in place, ensuring it could not make another move as the last vestiges of unlife drained from its vacant eyes. A few moments later, he casually discarded the lifeless corpse, turning his attention back to retrieve his axe. With his axe in hand once more, he pivoted to face the road, taking in the scene. The approaching mob was as scattered as it was likely to get. Taking a deep breath, he tightened his grip on the weapon and made his move. The woodsman moved swiftly, dashing through the snow-covered woods toward the highway. He used the axe as a battering ram, shoving the wooden handle into a ghoul's chest and propelling it backward into several others, causing them to tumble to the ground as he pressed onward. He refrained from swinging his weapon because any deep connection might lead to its loss. The creatures were dangerously close, leaving him no choice but to continue his forward momentum, desperately hoping they wouldn't grab hold of him. As he closed in on the edge of the woods, he noticed that the fallen creatures from the road were still struggling to regain their footing on the slippery, snow-covered terrain. The woodsman grunted, digging deep to summon a burst of energy as he pressed onward. Rather than attempting to leap over them like an Olympic long jumper, he decided to use their backs as stepping stones. In his mind, it seemed like a brilliant idea, treating them as a path to safety. In reality, it played out more like one of those gimmicky game shows where contestants tackle obstacles that collapse for the sake of entertainment. On the first creature, he managed to push off successfully, but on the second, he had no choice but to propel himself as far as he could, using his momentum and leg strength to reach the road, albeit at an awkward angle. His foot touched the pavement, but he couldn't maintain his balance, tumbling over and skidding across the slick road on his shoulder, the impact rattling him to the core. There was little time to nurse his wounds, as the ghouls that he had bypassed were slowly getting back on their feet, determined to reach him. His joints ached as he struggled to stand. Clutching his trusty axe, he swung it a few times, taking down several creatures while making as much noise as possible. He managed to capture the attention of several of the creatures in the woods, but those at the edge of the road, near his driveway, remained oblivious, just out of earshot. The woodsman carefully picked his target, executing another violent swing of the axe. He stood there for a moment, surveying the dozens of ghouls that were now closing in on him, his hand patting the explosive device with a hopeful touch. "I hope this thing is as loud as I think it is," he muttered to himself with a wry smirk. With that thought, he turned and began moving toward the woods on the opposite side of the highway, preparing to carry out the final phase of his plan. Chapter 4. The woodsman sprinted through the thick, untouched forest, his breath visible in the chilly air. Unlike the neatly cleared area around his cabin by the highway, this part of the woods had been left to nature's whims. Tree limbs lashed against his chest with each stride, snapping off and forging a hasty path for any creature that might follow. Despite his desperate escape, the faint moans of pursuing threats echoed in his ears. His heart raced as he continued onward, the urgency of his situation evident. He risked a brief glance over his shoulder, spotting a small group of the undead emerging from the road and moving toward him. Aware that time was not on his side, he muttered to himself, "This is going to have to do." From his bag, he retrieved an improvised explosive device, placing it carefully atop a fallen tree. He pulled a lighter from his pocket, the same one he had taken from his first kill of the morning. The flame danced to life, and a surge of relief washed over him as he saw the fuse ignite. Wasting no time, he sprinted away from the explosive, venturing deeper into the woods. He knew the detonation would act as a dinner bell, summoning every ghoul with a mile radius. As he ran, his thoughts turned to his sanctuary, his hunting blind, which he had constructed years before he embraced the harsh solitude of this remote wilderness. He had chosen to forego the simplicity of his hunting blind for a more intense hunting experience, a choice that he now questioned. "You just had to have an intense hike every time you hunted, didn't you?" He chastised himself inwardly. His self-recrimination was abruptly interrupted by the distant sound of an explosion, its shockwave shaking the trees and causing fresh snow to cascade down upon him. He pressed forward, scanning the landscape until he finally spotted his target in the distance. Relief washed over him as he caught sight of the hunting blind, still perched high in a tree. However, the ladder that once provided access to it had decayed over the years, falling to the ground and disappearing beneath the blanket of snow. Urgency coursed through him, pushing him onward. "Think, think, think," he whispered to himself. Inspiration struck as he took a good look at his axe. "This would have been a lot easier when I was 20 years younger," he muttered with a wry smile, positioning the axe behind his head. With all the strength he could muster, he swung the blade into the tree trunk, embedding it securely. A firm tug confirmed its stability. Stepping back, he took a running start toward the tree. Just as he was about to leap, his boots slipped on the icy ground, and he collided face first with the tree, the impact cracking his nose and leaving him momentarily stunned. "Get up! Get up! You're not going out on a slip, damn it," he scolded himself, willing his body to respond. He rose to his feet, clearing the snow from his launching point. With determination and the distant moans as his eerie backdrop, he took a deep breath and charged forward, planting his foot with precision before launching himself toward the axe. With a desperate grab, he clung to it with his right hand and hoisted his other hand up just in time. Dangling for a moment, he fought to regain control, pulling himself up with every ounce of strength. Walking up the side of the tree, he reached as high as possible before finally seizing the bottom of the hunting blind. Securing a firm grip proved to be a struggle, but he persevered. With sheer determination, he pulled himself up and into the blind. Lying on his back, he gasped for air, blood flowing from his battered nose. It took a few moments for the distant moans to fill the air again, rekindling his sense of urgency. Forcing himself to sit back down, he settled into a position that required minimal movement. He knew that even the slightest noise could draw the attention of a single ghoul, setting off a calamitous chain reaction that would bring his relentless pursuers ever closer. In the darkness of the hunting blind, he steeled himself for the imminent danger, ready to endure whatever trials awaited him. In those crucial moments that followed, the woodsman's existence teetered on the precipice of sheer terror. Fear had frozen him in a state of absolute stillness. The distant, mournful moans grew steadily louder, a haunting crescendo that seemed to echo through the very fabric of his being. Soon, the clumsy footfalls of the ghouls became unmistakable as they blundered through the forest, snapping branches beneath their relentless advance. Desperation clung to him, urging him to exhale a sigh of relief as he heard the nightmarish procession pass beneath his concealed refuge. Yet he clung to his self-imposed silence, determined not to offer the slightest provocation. For an interminable hour, he remained cocooned in the shroud of silence, every nerve tuned to the eerie chorus of moans and the meandering dance of the undead. These abominations pursued the source of the earlier disturbance with a relentless, single-minded purpose, ignorant of having passed their quarry long ago. At last, the cacophony waned, leaving only the unsettling tranquility of falling snowflakes to fill the void. With caution, the woodsman shifted toward the window. He pulled the curtain aside, allowing his gaze to traverse the expanse toward the distant highway. There he found nothing, absolute stillness. The tension he'd harbored within finally dissipated, and he granted himself the long-awaited release of a sigh, a breath of liberation. The plan worked, he whispered, a muted celebration of his improbable survival. Okay, let's get back home. Still have things to do, he murmured to himself as he descended from the concealed vantage point. The axe remained firmly wedged in the tree, defying his attempts at retrieval, so he abandoned it for the time being. Not like anybody is going to come out and steal it. Plus, you never know when you're going to have to get back up there, he reasoned with a wry smile, acknowledging the ever-present need for vigilance. Despite the deceptive calm, he clung to a state of heightened alertness, cognizant of the necessity for continued silence. As he approached the highway, he found it devoid of any immediate threats, both ahead and behind him. This solitude, this utter isolation, had lured him to this secluded haven in the first place, and he was grateful to have it once more. Drawing nearer to his cabin, he spotted two unfortunate creatures entangled in the unforgiving embrace of barbed wire. They struggled desperately to reach the sanctuary of his cabin, its inviting glow a cruel tease to their tortured minds. The woodsman briefly contemplated employing the hammer, but ultimately favored his trusty bow. "I've put my muscles through enough today," he murmured as he took careful aim. With just two well-aimed shots, both creatures collapsed in somber defeat, their struggles silenced forever. He retrieved his weapons and continued toward the sheltering embrace of his home. As he pushed the door open, the welcoming warmth of the fire and the sight of Jenny and Peter, each nursing a drink, greeted him. Jenny leaped to her feet and hurried over. "Are you okay? We were so worried when we heard that explosion," she exclaimed, her concern evident in her eyes. "Yeah, we thought the worst," Peter added, his relief palpable. The woodsman offered a reassuring nod to his guests. "I'm okay. Sore as hell, but okay." "What happened? Are we safe?" Jenny inquired, her voice trembling with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. Once more, the woodsman nodded. "As safe as we can be." "What about the mob that followed us?" Jenny inquired. "Wandering off into the woods on the other side of the highway. They shouldn't be a problem. At least not in those numbers. We're going to have to keep watch, however, because that barricade outside isn't going to hold much for long," the woodsman replied. Peter volunteered to take the first watch, and the woodsman accepted, advising him to keep watch from the window to avoid exposure to the biting cold. With Peter on guard duty, the woodsman settled by the fire, soaking in its warmth beside Jenny. Her expression conveyed a deep sense of gratitude. "We can't thank you enough for taking us in," Jenny said earnestly. "You're welcome," the woodsman replied, though he added a note of practicality. "But be aware that you'll need to earn your keep here. I don't run a charity, and our food supply won't sustain 3 people indefinitely. Of course, we'll do whatever we need to do to help out. I can't speak for Peter, but I've done my fair share of hunting, so that should contribute to our food situation," Jenny assured him. "Gun or bow?" the woodsman asked. "Bow, of course. It's more sporting that way. Besides, I enjoy the workout when I hunt," Jenny replied, her confidence shining through. The woodsman couldn't help but grin, recognizing a kindred spirit in the young woman. "Well, I have a handful of bows that you're more than welcome to. Tomorrow, we'll head out, and I'll show you some of my favorite spots." "I look forward to it," Jenny replied, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. As Jenny's cup ran dry, she noted, "I'm going to get some more hot water to warm up. There's some instant coffee in the cupboard. If you wouldn't mind making me a cup, I'll be happy to share," the woodsman offered. "You've got a deal," Jenny agreed, smiling as she made her way to the kitchen. The woodsman released a long, contented sigh, relieved to have survived the day. Yet he knew that challenges lay ahead with 2 additional mouths to feed. A sudden thought tickled his humor, and he chuckled softly to himself. Years of solitude when the world was filled with chaos. Now, the only 2 people within 100 miles find me and move in. I'm not entirely convinced there's a God, but if there is, he's certainly enjoying a good laugh over this one. The end.